Chapter 6. House Rules. Lachlan groaned as Alyssa dragged him inside, his weight nearly knocking her off balance. "For someone who can turn into a wolf, you're heavier than you look," she muttered, easing him down onto the couch. "Sorry to inconvenience you," Lachlan rasped, attempting a smirk but wincing instead. Alyssa shook her head, grabbing the first aid kit from the shelf. "I'm guessing your shifter powers don't include healing instantly. Only in the movies," Lachlan replied, leaning back against the cushions with a wince. "And trust me, I wish that part was real." She pulled out a roll of bandages and a bottle of antiseptic, kneeling beside him. "I'll be honest, I have no idea how to treat werewolf injuries, so try not to die, okay?" "I'll do my best," Lachlan said, cracking a faint grin. As Alyssa dabbed antiseptic onto the gash along his ribs, Lachlan sucked in a sharp breath. "Oh, come on," she teased. "You literally fought another wolf in the woods, and this is what gets you?" "It burns," he grumbled. "You're supposed to be gentle," Alyssa snorted. "You're not exactly in a position to make demands." Despite his injuries, Lachlan chuckled softly, and Alyssa found herself smiling without realizing it. It was strange how quickly the atmosphere shifted, from life-threatening danger to light banter in the middle of her cabin. "All right," she said after finishing the bandage. "You're patched up. Don't bleed on my couch." Lachlan raised an eyebrow. "I'll try to restrain myself." Alyssa stood and crossed her arms. She stared down at him for a moment, debating her next words. "You can stay," she finally said, sighing. "Just until you can walk without looking like you've been hit by a truck." Lachlan's eyes softened. "Thanks." She pointed at him with mock seriousness. "But there are rules. Rule 2. Rule 1. Don't shift in the cabin. I don't need claw marks on the furniture." "Fair enough." Rule 2. No howling at the moon. "I like my sleep," Lachlan grinned. "I'll keep it down." "And Rule 3. If you see me making coffee, don't talk to me until I've had at least 2 cups." "I'll remember that one." Alyssa dropped her hands to her sides, letting out a breath. "Seriously, though, you saved me back there. I guess I owe you." Lachlan met her gaze. "You don't owe me anything, Alyssa, but I appreciate the couch." She gave him a small nod before heading toward the kitchen. As she put the first aid kit away, she felt the tension in her shoulders loosen slightly. Maybe having someone else around wasn't the worst thing. Later that evening, the fire crackled softly as snow fell outside. Alyssa sat in her usual chair, reading, while Lachlan stretched out on the couch. Half asleep, but clearly still in pain. "You know," Alyssa said without looking up, "I have to ask, why exactly are they after you?" Alyssa's eyes opened slowly. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then with a quiet sigh, he sat up, wincing as he shifted. "It's not just me they're after anymore," he said, his voice serious. Alyssa lowered the book. "What do you mean?" Alyssa lowered the book. "What do you mean?" Alyssa knew what it was doing. Lachlan's golden eyes met hers, steady and calm. "They know about you." Alyssa's stomach dropped. "So," she said, closing the book with a thud, "what you're saying is I'm part of this mess now." Lachlan offered a small, apologetic smile. "Pretty much." Alyssa let out a long sigh and leaned back in her chair. "I should have left you in the snow." Alyssa was halfway through chopping wood when she heard footsteps behind her. "If that's you, Lachlan, I'm not carrying you back inside again, she called over her shoulder, splitting the log with one swing. Good thing I'm not Lachlan, a voice replied. Alyssa spun around, axe in hand, ready to defend herself from whoever decided to stroll onto her land. Instead, she found a tall, broad-shouldered man leaning casually against a tree. His dark hair fell into his eyes, and he wore a leather jacket way too thin for the freezing weather. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, like he was amused by the fact she almost brained him with an axe. "Who the hell are you?" Alyssa demanded, not lowering the axe. "Corbin," he said easily. "I'm with Lachlan." "Really?" Alyssa narrowed her eyes. "Because he didn't mention you. And honestly, I don't trust random guys wandering around my property." Corbin shrugged. "Fair enough. But if I wanted to cause trouble, I wouldn't stand here letting you threaten me with that thing." Alyssa hated that he had a point. Before she could think of a witty comeback, the cabin door creaked open, and Lachlan stepped outside, his arms still wrapped in a sling. Corbin snickered dirtily, and Lachlan stepped outside, his arms still wrapped in a sling. "Corbin," Lachlan greeted, rubbing the back of his neck. "Took you long enough?" "You're the one bleeding all over the place," Corbin replied, nodding toward him. "I came as fast as I could." Alyssa lowered the axe, just a little. "So you actually know him?" Lachlan gave a small nod. "Yeah. Corbin's one of the few wolves I trust." Corbin grinned. "And the only one who puts up with him." Alyssa let out a breath and finally rested the axe on the chopping block. "All right, you can stay, but if you scratch my furniture, you're out." "No promises," Corbin said, smirking as he walked up to the cabin. Inside, Corbin sank onto the couch like he owned the place. Alyssa wasn't thrilled about that, but at least Lachlan seemed glad to see him. "Nice place," Corbin said, eyeing the small but cozy interior. "Didn't expect Lachlan to hide out somewhere so homey." "He didn't," Alyssa replied flatly, setting a mug of coffee in front of him. "This is my place. He just showed up half dead and decided to stay." Corbin chuckled. "Sounds about right." Lachlan sat across from him, leaning forward with a slight wince. "Enough small talk. What did you find out?" Corbin's easygoing expression shifted, his smile fading. "They're close. Too close. I spotted Kael's pack near the river yesterday. They're tracking your scent." Alyssa crossed her arms, suddenly feeling a lot less comfortable in her own home. "I thought you said they wouldn't come here." Corbin glanced at Lachlan. "You didn't tell her." Alyssa pressed, narrowing her eyes. Who knew how? Corbin thought. And I figured. Corbin sighed. "Look, your property is complicated. This land sits right between Kael's pack territory and the neutral zone. It's pretty much the last piece of unclaimed ground in the area." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "So what you're saying is I built my cabin in the middle of some supernatural turf war?" "Basically," Corbin said with a shrug. "Fantastic," she muttered, rubbing her temples. "I could have bought a condo in town, but no. I wanted peace and quiet," Corbin chuckled. "Well, you got wolves instead. Welcome to the club." Alyssa shot him a look. "I'm not in any club. I'm just trying to survive the winter without getting eaten." Corbin raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fair enough. But if Kael's pack keeps sniffing around, you won't have a choice. They'll see you as part of this now." Alyssa glanced at Lachlan, who avoided her gaze. "So I'm basically on the menu?" she asked. "Not if we keep them out," Lachlan said firmly. Corbin nodded, though his expression was skeptical. We can try, but you need to be ready, Alyssa. This might get worse before it gets better. Alyssa sighed, sinking into the chair by the fire. Great, just what I needed. A pack of angry werewolves ruining my off-grid dream. Corbin grinned. Hey, look on the bright side. At least you've got Lachlan to protect you. Alyssa gave Lachlan a sideways glance. Oh, yeah, she said dryly. I feel so safe. Lachlan shook his head with a faint smile, but as the fire crackled quietly between them, Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that Corbin was right. This wasn't over, and it was only going to get harder from here. Chapter 7. Close Quarters. The snowstorm howled outside, rattling the windows and blanketing the cabin in white. Alyssa tossed another log into the fire, brushing her hands off on her jeans. Guess we're snowed in, she said, glancing over at Lachlan, who sat on the couch, stretching out his injured arm. Could be worse, Lachlan replied, watching the fire with a lazy grin. At least there's food. At least, and questionable company, Alyssa added with a smirk. Lachlan raised an eyebrow. I'm charming. You're lucky to be stuck with me. Alyssa snorted. Sure. Charming like a stray dog that won't leave. Lachlan laughed softly, shaking his head. Silence settled between them after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The fire crackled softly, and Alyssa found herself stealing glances at him from time to time. There was something about Lachlan that felt steady, even with the whole wolf thing. As if he could sense her staring, Lachlan finally looked up. What? Nothing, Alyssa said quickly. But then curiosity got the better of her. Okay, actually, why do you live like this? Alone, I mean. Don't shifters usually stick to packs? Lachlan leaned back against the couch, his expression shifting to something more distant. I used to, he said quietly. But not every pack is good. Alyssa frowned. What happened? Lachlan hesitated for a moment, then sighed. My old pack, Kael's pack, wasn't just about survival. It was about power. I didn't agree with how they handled things, so I left. Let's just say Kael didn't appreciate that. Alyssa nodded slowly. Sounds familiar. Lachlan raised an eyebrow. You ran from something too? She shrugged. Sort of. I guess I just got tired of people. The whole off-grid life seemed easier. Until I showed up, he teased. Alyssa smirked. Exactly. They both laughed, but there was something unspoken in the air. Alyssa had never told anyone why she really moved out here. The isolation was supposed to protect her. From disappointment, from people, from herself. Now here she was, snowed in with a wolf man who somehow understood that without her even saying it. Lachlan's gaze softened as he watched her. You're not as alone as you think, Alyssa. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she sat beside him, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them both. An hour passed. Maybe 2. Alyssa wasn't sure how it happened, but at some point Lachlan's arms slid around her shoulders. She didn't stop him. The closeness felt nice. Maybe it was the storm outside. Maybe it was the way Lachlan's voice sounded when he told her more about his past. Soft, like he hadn't talked about it in a long time. Or maybe it was just the fact that, For the first time in a while, she didn't feel so guarded. One thing led to another, and by the time the fire burned low, Alyssa found herself tangled up with Lachlan beneath one of the thick blankets on the couch. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even that serious. But it felt right. Later, Alyssa leaned against Lachlan's chest, his arm draped lazily over her waist. The cabin was quiet, except for the faint crackling of the fire. "Well," Alyssa said, breaking the silence. "That escalated quickly," Lachlan chuckled, brushing his fingers through her hair. "Yeah, I didn't see that coming." She tilted her head to look at him. "We're not making this a thing, right?" "Right. No strings, just happened." "Cool." Alyssa nodded, trying to sound more casual than she felt. There was another brief silence. Lachlan's eyes flicked toward the window, his easygoing expression fading. "What?" Alyssa asked, sitting up slightly. Lachlan narrowed his eyes, his body tensing beneath the blanket. "They're closer." Alyssa's heart skipped. "The pack?" He nodded, sitting up fully. "They're moving. We don't have much time before they try to cross the boundary." Alyssa sighed and reached for her shirt. "Great. So much for the afterglow." Lachlan smiled faintly but didn't relax. As Alyssa dressed and grabbed her rifle from the corner, she realized something. No matter how complicated this got, she wasn't facing it alone. She faced it in her heart to save the flock. Alyssa stood in the middle of the clearing, arms crossed, watching Lachlan pace around her like some kind of overly serious gym coach. "All right," Lachlan said, cracking his knuckles. "Lesson 1. When you're up against a wolf, don't freeze." "Right," Alyssa said, deadpan, "because my first instinct is usually to hug them." Lachlan grinned. "Hey, you never know. Some wolves are into that." Alyssa rolled her eyes. "So what am I supposed to do? Politely ask them to leave my property?" Lachlan stopped pacing and faced her. "No, you stand your ground. Look bigger. And if that doesn't work..." "Run for my life?" He smirked. "Exactly, but preferably after giving them a reason not to follow." Alyssa groaned. "You mean fight them?" "Not fight," Lachlan corrected. "Just make them regret getting too close." She raised an eyebrow. "Easy for you to say, Mr. Turns into a giant wolf." Lachlan chuckled and stepped closer. "That's why we're practicing." With his own hand, he placed his fingers to her lips. For the next hour, Lachlan put her through the weirdest training session she'd ever experienced. He showed her how to block and dodge, because wolves don't like to chase things that hit back, and how to swing a staff to keep distance. Alyssa wasn't sure why he thought she'd ever carry a staff, but he insisted. "Can't I just use the axe?" she asked, swinging the wooden stick awkwardly. Lachlan ducked easily under her swing, grinning. "Axes are heavier. You'll tire out faster." "Yeah, but they look way cooler." "I'll give you that." Lachlan stepped behind her, adjusting her grip. His hands rested lightly on hers, and for a second, Alyssa forgot they were supposed to be fighting off wolves. "You're holding it wrong," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "Or maybe I'm just being creative," Alyssa replied, trying to ignore the fact that her heart was suddenly beating faster. "Creativity is good. Dying isn't." She sighed. "Fine. Teach me, O wise one." Lachlan laughed and stepped back, leaving her feeling slightly colder than she expected. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, Elise's arms ached, and her legs felt like jelly. She flopped onto the ground, panting. "I think I'm done." Lachlan sat next to her, looking way too relaxed for someone who'd just dodged wooden staffs all afternoon. "You're getting better." "Better at being exhausted," Elisa muttered. "Better at surviving," Lachlan corrected. She glanced at him, brushing hair out of her face. "Oh, does this mean I won't die horribly if a wolf shows up?" Lachlan's expression grew more serious. "It means you'll have a fighting chance." Before Elisa could respond, the faint sound of snow crunching behind them made both of them freeze. Lachlan's head snapped up, eyes narrowing toward the edge of the clearing. Elisa turned slowly. And there it was. A wolf, bigger than any she'd seen, stood just beyond the trees. Its fur was a dark shade of gray, and its glowing eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, no one moved. Then the wolf growled low and deep, sending a shiver down Lisa's spine. Lachlan stepped protectively in front of her, his muscles tense. "Is that one of Kael's?" Lisa whispered, gripping the staff tighter, even though she doubted it'd help. "Yeah," Lachlan said quietly. "I thought so too," Lachlan said, still watching the trees carefully. Elisa swallowed the lump in her throat. "Great. I love it when you're wrong about the dangerous stuff." Lachlan's gaze softened as he glanced down at her. "You handled it well." "I didn't do anything except panic quietly," Elisa said, half joking, though her hands were still shaking. Lachlan crouched in front of her, gently taking the staff from her hands and setting it aside. "You didn't run. That's more than most would do." Alyssa met his eyes, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The snow, the fading sunlight, even the rival wolf lurking somewhere nearby. Lachlan brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering for just a second longer than necessary. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. His heart fluttered, but she masked it with a smirk. "You better not be flirting with me after nearly getting me killed." Lachlan chuckled. "I think you'd know if I was flirting." "Sure," she teased, standing up and brushing snow off her jeans. "I'll just assume all the life-threatening danger is your version of a romantic gesture." Lachlan grinned, but his eyes still flicked to the wolf as if expecting the rival wolf to return. "We should head back," he said, offering her a hand. Alyssa took it, and as he pulled her up, she realized something. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't facing the world alone. She felt like she wasn't facing the world alone, and her eyes did so. Chapter 8. Into the Woods. Alyssa adjusted the strap on her rifle and glanced over her shoulder. The cabin was already out of sight, swallowed by the thick forest. Lachlan had gone scouting on the other side of the property, leaving her to check the nearby traps alone. She told herself it wasn't a big deal. She could handle it. After all, she'd trained with Lachlan for the past few days. She knew what to do. Still, as she trudged deeper into the woods, the silence pressed down on her. No birds, no wind, just the soft crunch of snow under her boots. "Calm down. It's just a routine check." Alyssa gripped the rifle tighter. She wasn't scared. Not really. At least that's what she told herself. By the time she reached the first trap, Alyssa felt a little more relaxed. Well, the trap was making her feel safer. No routine check. Alyssa gripped the rifle tighter. She wasn't scared. No footprints. No signs of anything nearby. She reset the trap and moved on to the next, humming quietly under her breath to fill the silence. The second and third traps were just as empty. She was ready to give up. Alyssa started to feel ridiculous for being so tense. See? No big deal. She was halfway to the fourth trap when something made her stop. It was faint, a soft rustle in the trees up ahead. Alyssa froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she scanned the woods, her heart pounding in her ears. For a lone moment, nothing happened. Then she saw it. A lone wolf, pacing just beyond the trees. Its fur was dark, almost blending into the shadows, but its glowing eyes gave it away. It wasn't as big as the others she'd seen, but it was still larger than any normal wolf. Alyssa swallowed hard. Don't freeze. Don't run. Lachlan's words echoed in her head, but it was easier said than done. Alyssa tightened her grip on the rifle and forced herself to stand her ground. Back off, she muttered, raising the barrel slightly. The wolf growled low in its throat, but it didn't charge. Instead, it circled her slowly, as if testing to see how much she would let it push. Alyssa took a deep breath and planted her feet firmly in the snow. "If you think I'm running, you're wrong," she said, louder this time. She kept the rifle steady, tracking the wolf's every move. After what felt like forever, the wolf finally stopped circling. It stared at her, ears flicking forward. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the woods. Alyssa stood frozen, watching the spot where it had vanished. Her heart was still racing, but she hadn't panicked. She hadn't run. Alyssa did it. With a shaky breath, Alyssa lowered the rifle, but just as relief washed over her, something else sank in. It was alone, which meant the others, the real threat, weren't far behind. Lachlan was waiting for her when she returned to the cabin. His eyes narrowed as he saw the tension in her face. "What happened?" he asked immediately. Alyssa leaned the rifle against the wall and exhaled. "Ran into one of Kael's wolves. It didn't attack." Lachlan's expression darkened. "They're testing you." "Yeah," Alyssa muttered, dropping onto the couch. It felt like that. Lachlan crossed his arms, pacing slightly. "They're getting bolder," he said after a moment. "It won't be long before they stop circling and start attacking." Alyssa looked up at him. "How soon?" Lachlan met her gaze, his golden eyes sharp. "Soon enough that we need to be ready. Soon." Without a word, Lachlan met her in the stairway and lifted her. Alyssa had just finished stacking firewood when Corbin's voice echoed across the clearing. "You know, I'm starting to think you like showing off." She turned to find him leaning casually against the porch railing, watching her with that usual cocky smirk. Lachlan stood beside him, arms crossed but clearly amused. "Not showing off," Alyssa said, tossing another log onto the pile. "Just preparing for the inevitable werewolf invasion." Corbin grinned. "Oh, she's funny too. I see why you keep her around, Lachlan." Alyssa shot him a glare. "I'm not around. This is my cabin. You're the intruders." "Technicalities," Corbin replied with a shrug. Lachlan chuckled, shaking his head. "You're lucky she hasn't thrown you in the snow yet." Still time," Alyssa muttered, wiping her hands on her jeans. Before Corbin could throw back another comment, a low growl sounded from the edge of the clearing, filling the silence. "I'm not around. This is my comment," A low growl sounded from the edge of the clearing. Alyssa froze. Corbin straightened, his smirk vanishing, as all three of them turned toward the trees. A dark shape emerged. Another wolf, larger than the one Alyssa had faced the day before. It padded forward slowly, head low, eyes glowing in the fading afternoon light. "Great," Alyssa muttered under her breath. "Just what I needed." Lachlan's hand instinctively moved toward her arm. "Stay behind me." "I got this," she interrupted, stepping forward. Lachlan blinked. "Wait, what?" Corbin raised an eyebrow. "Oh, this I have to see." Alyssa ignored them both, gripping the staff she had leaned against the cabin earlier. The wolf circled slowly, growling louder. "Stay here now. Look bigger. Don't panic." Alyssa exhaled and squared her shoulders. The wolf took another step forward. Alyssa narrowed her eyes. "All right, buddy. I don't care how tough you think you are. This is my cabin. So unless you want to end up with a headache, I suggest you scram." The wolf growled, baring its teeth. "Oh, you think I'm kidding?" Alyssa raised the staff. "I'll smack you so hard, you'll think you got hit by a tree." Corbin snorted from behind her. "She's got spirit, I'll give her that." Lachlan frowned but didn't stop her. The wolf crept closer, muscles tensing like it was ready to pounce. Alyssa didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward and slammed the staff into the snow in front of her, the sharp crack echoing through the clearing. The wolf hesitated. Alyssa pointed the staff directly at it. "Last warning, go find someone else to bother." The wolf locked eyes with her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, it actually huffed, and slunk back into the woods. Alyssa lowered the staff, her heart pounding, but she didn't let it show. Behind her, Corbin let out a low whistle. "Well, damn," he said, grinning. "I think I'm a little impressed. Shall we?" Alyssa turned toward them, raising an eyebrow. "A little?" Corbin laughed. "Okay, fine. You handled that better than I thought you would." Lachlan nodded, his expression softening. "You did well." Alyssa tried to play it cool, but the warmth in Lachlan's eyes made her stomach flip. "Yeah, well," she said, shrugging. "I learn from the best." Corbin nudged Lachlan with his elbow. "Hear that? You're rubbing off on her." Lachlan smirked. "Apparently." Alyssa rolled her eyes. "Don't let it go to your head." But as much as she tried to brush it off, she couldn't ignore the flicker of pride she felt. For once, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She felt like she belonged. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lachlan's easygoing demeanor faded. "They'll be back," he said, his tone more serious. "That was just a scout." Alyssa frowned. "Scout for what?" Lachlan's golden eyes darkened. "For the rest of the pack, a full-scale attack is coming." Alyssa's stomach twisted. "How soon?" Alyssa glanced toward the woods, his jaw tight. "Soon enough." Chapter 9. Trouble in the Dark. The night air was cold enough to bite, but Alyssa didn't mind. She trudged beside Lachlan, boots crunching over the frozen snow as they patrolled the edge of the clearing. The moon hung low, casting silver light across the woods. "Remind me why we're doing this again?" Alyssa asked, adjusting the rifle slung over her shoulder. "Because Kael's wolves don't take vacations," Lachlan replied, scanning the tree line. Great. So while normal people watch movies, I'm out here playing security guard against a pack of angry werewolves. Lachlan smirked. Welcome to the exciting life of off-grid living. Alyssa rolled her eyes. Yeah, real glamorous. For a while they walked in silence, their breath hanging in the air like fog. Alyssa had to admit, it wasn't terrible having Lachlan by her side. The whole supernatural wolf thing, still weird, but at least she wasn't dealing with it alone. Then, of course, something had to ruin the peaceful vibe. A low growl echoed from the woods, making Alyssa freeze mid-step. Lachlan stopped too, his posture instantly rigid. His sharp gaze scanned the trees, golden eyes flashing in the moonlight. "Tell me that was your stomach," Alyssa whispered, gripping the rifle. Lachlan shook his head slowly. No. Awesome." Another growl followed, this time from the opposite side. Lachlan spun, trying to keep both sides in view. Lachlan," she said, voice tight. "I think we're surrounded." "Yeah, I noticed." 2 wolves stepped into the clearing, their eyes glowing faintly. One was massive with thick gray fur, while the other was smaller and leaner, its dark coat blending with the shadows. The bigger one bared its teeth. Alyssa swallowed hard. "So, how do we handle this?" Carefully, Lachlan took a step forward, his body tense. The wolves stalked closer, their low growls vibrating through the air. Alyssa shifted the rifle, lining it up with the smaller wolf. "I thought they weren't supposed to cross the perimeter." "They're not," Lachlan said quietly. "Which means they're testing how far they can go." Fantastic. The larger wolf lunged without warning, heading straight for Lachlan. He shifted instantly, clothes shredding as his body twisted into his wolf form. "Really could have used that heads up," Alyssa shouted. The smaller wolf darted toward her, snapping at her legs. Alyssa yelped, stumbling backward as she raised the rifle. She fired off a shot, but it missed by a mile. "Focus, Alyssa," Lachlan's voice rang through her head. "Telepathy." That was still unsettling.
Easier said than done.
The smaller wolf lunged again. This time, Alyssa didn't run. She swung the butt of the rifle hard, smacking the wolf in the snout. It yelped, stumbling sideways.
"Oh my God,"
she muttered. "I just hit a werewolf with a gun. I'm living in a horror movie with a glaring." Claws flashed in a fierce fight with the larger wolf, their snarls echoing through the clearing. Claws flashed, and snow kicked up around them as they slammed into the ground. Alyssa swung the rifle again, keeping the second wolf at bay. When it lunged, she pulled the trigger, this time grazing its leg. The wolf yelped and limped back into the trees. "Yeah, that's right," Alyssa called after it, trying to sound tough despite her trembling hands. "Run!" Lachlan finished off the larger wolf with one last bite, sending it limping into the woods. His wolf form shivered, fur matted with blood as he shifted back into human form. He crouched down, panting. "Well, that could have gone worse." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "You're bleeding everywhere, and I nearly got eaten." "No one's dead. I'll take that as a win." "No one's dead. I'll take that as a win." "Your standards are terrifyingly low." As Lachlan stood, something on the side of the cabin caught Alyssa's eye. She jogged over, her heart sinking as she got closer. Deep claw marks were scratched into the wood. Deep claw marks were scratched into the wood. Alyssa's stomach twisted. Lachlan?" she called. He joined her, his face hardening as he read the message. Subtle, Alyssa muttered. I guess Kael's wolves aren't big on the whole peace and love thing. Lachlan's jaw tightened. No, this was a warning. Alyssa exhaled slowly, staring at the message. Will, I'm not leaving. Lachlan glanced at her, eyes softening. I know, and that's why we need to prepare. Alyssa met his gaze, determination settling in her chest. Then, let's get ready. Alyssa leaned against the porch railing, staring at the claw marks still etched into the side of her cabin. She'd already scrubbed at them twice, but no amount of effort made leave or die any less threatening. So, she said, side-eyeing Lachlan as he paced nearby. Are all werewolf packs this passive-aggressive, or is it just yours? Lachlan snorted, but the usual glint of humor in his eyes wasn't there. It's not about being passive-aggressive, he muttered. It's about territory. Alyssa raised an eyebrow. Right, because nothing says, this land is mine, like carving death threats into someone's house. Lachlan stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair. His golden eyes flicked to the woods before settling back on her. There's something I need to tell you, he said, voice unusually serious. Oh, great. I love conversations that start like that, Alyssa replied, folding her arms. Lachlan hesitated, clearly trying to figure out how to break whatever news he was holding on to. Kael, he finally said, is my brother. Alyssa blinked. I'm sorry, what now? Lachlan shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I probably should have mentioned that sooner. You think? Alyssa straightened, pointing at the scratch marks. Your brother wrote that on my house? To be fair, I doubt he personally scratched it in, Lachlan said, holding up his hands. He's more of the send minions to do his dirty work type. Oh, well that makes it so much better, Alyssa deadpanned. So what's his problem? Family feud gone wrong? Lachlan sighed. It's more complicated than that. Kael isn't like me. He doesn't just want power. He wants control. He thinks this land, your land, holds something that can expand his territory. Alyssa frowned. What, is there gold buried under my cabin or something? Lachlan shook his head. Not exactly. There's a boundary here, an old one. This land blocks Kael from spreading his influence any further west. As long as the cabin stands, the boundary stays in place. Alyssa stared at him. So let me get this straight. I moved to the middle of nowhere, built a cabin on top of a magical werewolf barrier, and now your brother wants to murder me because of it? Pretty much, Lachlan said with a sheepish shrug. Alyssa rubbed her temples. Of course. Why wouldn't that happen? I didn't know at first, Lachlan added quickly. I swear I thought Kael was just after me. But now it's clear. He wants this land. Alyssa lowered her hands, exhaling slowly. So, I'm not just caught in your werewolf drama. I'm a key part of it. Lachlan gave her a weak smile. I guess you could say that. Awesome, Alyssa muttered, glancing at the woods. Love being part of a mystical turf war, really living the off-grid dream. Lachlan stepped closer, his gaze softening. I won't let Kael get to you, I promise. Alyssa wanted to believe him, but something still nagged at her. She glanced at the trees, her eyes narrowing. Wait a second, she said. If Kael's after this land, how long has he been watching me? Lachlan hesitated. A while. Alyssa turned slowly to him. Define a while. Lachlan winced. Probably since you moved in. Her mouth fell open. You mean to tell me I've been living under supernatural surveillance for 2 years and no one thought to send a memo? Lachlan scratched the back of his neck. Yeah, sorry about that. Alyssa groaned, sinking onto the porch steps. Great, I'm probably in some werewolf neighborhood watch program. Lachlan sat beside her, nudging her shoulder lightly. Look, Kael might have been watching, but he hasn't made a move until now. That means something changed. Oh, wonderful, Alyssa said sarcastically. What changed? Did I paint the cabin the wrong color? Lachlan grinned. Nah, he's just probably running out of patience. Alyssa sighed, rubbing her face. Well, that's comforting. For a moment, they sat in silence, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Finally, Alyssa glanced at him. Okay, so what do we do now? Lachlan's golden eyes met hers. We fight. Alyssa shook her head. No offense, but we don't exactly stand much of a chance against a whole pack. We're not alone, Lachlan replied. Corbin's still around, and I have a few more allies I can call. Alyssa let out a long breath, nodding slowly. Fine. But if your brother decides to scratch anything else into my house, you're fixing it. Lachlan laughed. Deal. But as Alyssa stared out at the darkening woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that Kael's wolves were already watching. And something told her they wouldn't wait much longer. Chapter 10. Fight or Flight? Alyssa tossed another log into the fire, watching the flames crackle and spit. Outside, the snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, blanketing the clearing in silence. Lachlan stood near the window, arms crossed, staring out into the woods like he expected something to burst through at any second. His jaw was tight, and he'd been unusually quiet for the past hour. Finally, he broke the silence. You need to leave. Alyssa blinked, turning to face him. Excuse me? Lachlan didn't look at her. It's not safe here anymore. Kael's getting closer. His wolves won't stop until they've taken this land. Alyssa snorted, folding her arms. Yeah, I kinda got that when they scratched "Leave or Die" into my cabin. I'm serious, Alyssa, Lachlan said, his voice firm. Pack up, head into town, and stay there until this is over. She narrowed her eyes. Oh, great plan. I'll just check into a nice bed and breakfast while you handle your family drama. Should I leave cookies on the counter for the wolves too? Lachlan turned to face her, frustration flickering in his eyes. I'm trying to protect you. Alyssa's fists clenched at her sides. Yeah, well, I'm not exactly the damsel in distress type. This isn't about being tough, Lachlan snapped. Kael doesn't care how stubborn you are. If he thinks you're in his way, he won't hesitate. Then let him come, Alyssa shot back, her voice rising. I'm not running, Lachlan. You should, he growled, stepping closer. You don't have to stay here. You didn't ask for this fight. Alyssa's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. And do you think I haven't been running my whole life? Every time something got hard, every time people let me down, I left. Alyssa shouted one more time. Every time people let me down, I left. This cabin is the only thing I've built for myself. I'm not leaving it just because your brother's got a territorial complex. Lachlan's expression softened, but his eyes stayed locked on hers. I get that, he said quietly. But I'd rather have you alive than buried under the snow. Alyssa exhaled, her frustration simmering down to something more fragile. Look, I know this is dangerous, But if I leave now, what's stopping Kael from coming after me anyway? I'm part of this, Lachlan, whether I like it or not. Lachlan hesitated for a long moment, then sighed. You're impossible. Yep, Alyssa replied, flashing a small grin. Get used to it. Lachlan shook his head but couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at his lips. Before either of them could say more, the front door creaked open, and Corbin stepped inside, brushing snow off his coat. Well, he said, his usual cocky grin absent. I hate to interrupt the bonding moment, but we've got a problem. Alyssa frowned. What now? Corbin's eyes flicked to Lachlan. Kael's pack. They're assembling on the ridge. His whole pack. Alyssa's stomach dropped, Lachlan asked, his tone dark. Corbin shrugged. A day, maybe less. They're moving fast. Alyssa exchanged a look with Lachlan. She had made her choice. Now they just had to survive it. Alyssa crouched behind a fallen log, gripping her rifle tightly, as the cold air bit at her face. Snow crunched softly underfoot as Lachlan and Corbin moved silently beside her. All right, Lachlan whispered, eyes scanning the dark forest ahead. Kael's camp is just beyond that ridge. We go in, break as much as we can, and get out, quick and quiet. Alyssa nodded, but she couldn't help raising an eyebrow. Quick and quiet? You do realize we're dealing with werewolves, right? Corbin smirked, brushing snow off his jacket. Hey, give us some credit. We can be sneaky when we need to be. I'll believe it when I see it, Alyssa muttered, adjusting the strap on her rifle. The plan was simple. Hit Kael's camp before he could launch his attack. If they could scatter his wolves and dismantle a few traps, it might buy them more time, or, at the very least, send a message that they weren't backing down. Ready? Lachlan asked, his golden eyes flicking toward Alyssa. She took a deep breath. Let's do this. The camp wasn't hard to find. A series of tents and scattered fires lit up the clearing, wolves in both human and animal form moving between the trees. Alyssa's heart pounded as they crept closer, sticking to the shadows. Okay, Lachlan whispered. Corbin, take the far side. Alyssa followed Lachlan, careful not to make a sound as they slipped into the camp. She knelt beside a trap, recognizing the jagged metal teeth from the ones she'd dismantled near her cabin. Seriously? Alyssa muttered under her breath. Who makes these things? Werewolf Home Depot? Lachlan chuckled softly. I wouldn't put it past Kael. Alyssa worked quickly, prying the trap open and jamming a branch into the mechanism to keep it from snapping shut again. One down. Across the clearing, Corbin knocked over a stack of supplies, scattering them into the snow. A few wolves growled in confusion, but he disappeared before they could catch him. It felt almost too easy. By the time they regrouped at the edge of the camp, Alyssa couldn't help but smile. Not bad, she said, nudging Lachlan with her elbow. I think we just made your brother look pretty stupid. Yeah, Lachlan replied, though his tone wasn't as light. Corbin jogged up, brushing snow off his hands. Well, that was fun. Think they'll notice? Before Alyssa could answer, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and broad-shouldered, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Kael, he stepped into the clearing, arms crossed, a slow smile spreading across his face. Well, Kael said, his voice smooth and calm. If I knew you'd be stopping by, I would have set out snacks. Alyssa's grip tightened on her rifle. Lachlan tensed beside her, his eyes narrowing. We're leaving, Kael shrugged, making no move to stop them. By all means. Corbin frowned. That's it? No fight? Kael shrugged. Oh, I wouldn't ruin the surprise. Ugh. But go ahead. Celebrate your little victory. Elisa's stomach twisted uneasily. As they retreated into the woods, Kael's eyes followed them. Somehow, she couldn't shake the feeling they had just walked straight into his trap.